So then we are back with the modern understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, when we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end, per Yirmiyahu the prophet. Then we find the 61st chapter, where then the first section relates with the spring feast, the second section relates with the autumn feast, and then the time of the restoration period, where the cities of the Messiah, laid waste for many centuries, then would return, thus tabernacling. So then the other area is then trade. So then we can understand Ezekiel the 37th chapter, the two sticks given then trade and tabernacling. So let's understand what goes on in the world thus far, as the new trade system is concerned. Let's then find first the first son Ishmael and where he came from. He was then the first son of Ibrahim. He was nicely treated, and then there was no tension or fights in his tent. The instructions, unfortunately, were changed later because of the lack of understanding of the first son. He was never thrown out. He was absolutely treated very properly as a son. Then, when Ibrahim became old, and then the boy obviously was then an adult, then the inheritance of Ibrahim obviously went with the first son, and he started then his freight company. How do we find the evidence? The evidence is found then in Genesis, or then Bereshit, where you find then Joseph, when he was sold into slavery, there was a caravan of the Ishmaelites. So it would be similar as if Ishmael would have a freight company, such as, for instance, FedEx, UPS, or then another freight company doing trade around the region. It was a simple fact of then trade routes from many areas of then the existing Egypt and the Delta area, where then the Ishmaelites were then doing trade. But then they started because Ishmael used then the inheritance of Ibrahim. So it shows you the normality of having a family, the normality of having a son, and then waiting, and then giving an inheritance, and then the son making the best use from this inheritance. So then we find the first son, and then later, then Ibrahim and his wife then continue on with their pilgrimage. Later then, quite some time later in fact, because Ibrahim had first established himself. So let's try to understand what this means. He had to start his company, he had to get a hold of the trade of the time, he had to have trustable people under his leadership. So then when we read the 62nd chapter of Yirmiyahu, then those using the turban, the golden turban, comes from the lineage or the kingship of Ishmael. Then we understand why then the authority of the first stick would be then delivered, and then they would establish themselves and would be this time then how they used to be. So then we understand then the trade that's coming must come via the Chinese because it's a pure trade. So the linkage with the new system must be via pure trade, and thus far China is the most powerful country in the world. But then there are the steps of formation in order for China to continue to be China, and then the Ishmaelites continuing being Ishmaelites. So the only area where then we can understand the trade then coming towards the Ishmaelites is because of the amount of crude or petroleum. Energy is going to be very scarce in the future because of the multiple thousands upon thousands of freight companies popping up everywhere because of the nature of the system. It is a pure trade. So pure trade can be taught via computer. So then you link with what then the angel told Daniel regarding then people would go to and fro. Understandably, the time of deceit would end, and it would end with a peak of knowledge, and this knowledge should be enough for the time of the restoration, where you simply get a decent computer, and then you do trade via computer. It's a pure trade. Then, when this takes place, then a bit after, the Messiah then speaks in the future. Then the freighters of the earth being in charge. We find the 8th chapter, then 10 chapters later. Then we understand the stick being restored. And obviously then tabernacling would be the returning of the holy cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As far as the Gentile level, we understand also there is the area of then the nations lining up themselves for the delivery of those sticks. Those two sticks must be re-delivered. So then we find ourselves then understanding tabernacling and then trade. But trade then is delivered via the lining up with the trades companies tracking system. That's where then the word lines up with freighting. Later then becomes trade. So let's evaluate then what went on. In 2008, prior of the ending of the 1,000 years of deceit, this country made a huge mistake when they gambled the future of our country via this house bust. Whosoever came with this crazy idea of this mortgage or the liar's loan simply gave away our country. Because as then the Chinese purchased the system and they got involved themselves with our mortgages, we thought we had generated a new thing, but then rather than we gave them our system. Now we find ourselves understanding why we should then line up our government with then the trading companies. It's a normal fact of understanding the delivery of the first stick. Or our country won't have then a subsystem then for being part of the new trade system. Because IMF already said a couple of years ago, if we continue then printing money on a rate back then, it wouldn't take more than 5 years. So this truly is our last chance to get ourselves then cleaned up. This means the government must come clean. We understand our president is not from United States. He's from Kenya. His birth certificate is false. It was then made it up. Then we understand also we must line up our government with the freighters so we can then charge taxes properly. Not only these, but our government should be leaned up. Not only these, there are areas of the government making friendships with companies and stealing the federal money. The greatest example is the Ozarks project. The Overwatch Systems then is building the new capital of our country, where then we are not going to be living over there. Because if we don't have a subsystem active, how are we going to become partners of then the starting bricks? The Balian system must not continue. Only Only the dragon system must continue. So what we are going to do as far as becoming then a responsible partner? But we used to do this in the past. We were trade partners in the past, during the 50s, during the 60s, during the 70s. But then power went ahead of the government and they lost the track. In other words, they became so monstrous in terms of size. And then the government refused to lean up. The reason why back then were then required so many of the departments, it's because they had to hire people with fast thinking, fast management to deal with the demand. These days, computer can do the work, but the government never leaned up because of the advent of the computer. On the contrary, they became larger and larger and larger, and today the system can't sustain itself. And it's not going to be a police state because there is nothing to police with. How is then our government going to function without a subsystem? We must become partners of the BRICS, because then we are in line with the instructions. As we understand, Daniel the 11th chapter pertains of this time of the restoration period, and we read the relationship of the Kingdom of the North, then Soviet Union, and the Kingdom of the South. Why do we say Soviet Union and not Russia? It's because their former then is restored, but not only the former, then higher than the former. So if you want to know how then the new Soviet Union is going to be, watch the politics of China, because it is related with the trade system of China. But then the Kingdom of the North, as managers, they must adapt their system with the Chinese system. However, they have their own personal way of doing their own while working for China. So it's not going to become Leningrad or Stalingrad, but then Soviet Union with a new management. But then the later higher than the former, as per the instructions. So then, and then the Kingdom of the South, then obviously Africa. And there is a representative of the Kingdom of the South, Mr. Zuma. That's why we have then the starting of the new trade system, preparing then the world's trade for the delivery of the first stick. If you evaluate very properly, you find that Mr. Zuma being responsible for the entire continent of Africa as a person acquainted with the holy instructions. If Mr. Zuma is not acquainted with the holy instructions, he only observes himself and a simple president of South Africa. But then because of the BRICS is the starting of the new trade system. Then he becomes the representative of the Southern Kingdom. So then at least the world is lining up with instructions, because thus far the world is in quote upside down. And we must have clear instructions from the instructions. So then the world can start investing properly. The BRICS is the place of investment. And then isolating Europe until they get resolved. Isolating North America until we get resolved. So then those areas can then adjust themselves, rebuild their subsystems, and becomes then partner of the new system. But then bad guys must be confronted. Thieves in the government must be confronted. Those people stealing from the government must be put in jail. This means FBI must do their work independently. CIA must do their work independently, honoring our Constitution. But if they are acting as a circus, a club, or a club of friends, then this country has no option. Then it would be ruined. What are they going to do in the Ozarks? There is nothing to do there because the system is going to be ruined. They were thinking themselves in some sort of a holy city in the midst of the country. What system are they going to use? And then if the government does not get lined up with the freighters, then the freighters have to pick up the tab at the end of the ruining. So the objective is truly simple, is then lining up the government, placing those responsible people in jail. If we want to do it properly, even the president should be in jail for being fraudulent. His birth certificate is a fraud. Either we do what is proper, or then the country ruins. And thus far, the economy is not adjusting itself because the government is not lining up. How can we become partners of the new system? We used to know these. It was very familiar back then. But then the government became very big and lost its management. The printing of money is absolutely criminal beyond measure. And then there are people in the government stealing, and then the authorities don't do their job. Because they think themselves always big shots, always higher than any other country, and they are understanding the holy instructions is given them the starting of the new system. And we are not updating ourselves as such. So then this Ozarks project should be then investigated by the FBI, CIA, finding out how this person, Steve, from the Overwatch systems, then built the place over there with no public review. It is a family home. How did he get the money to get this building built? And what is under it? The FBI must find government's money mixed up with his own. And that's fraud.